good afternoon and good evening to all the colleagues. 2010, we celebrated in Nagoya the current set of global biodiversity targets, the IC biodiversity targets, the adoption of them. We also adopted the Nagoya Protocol on Access and Benefit Sharing. But the most immediate and important follow-up to that were a set of commitments countries have started to put in place in terms of activities to realize some of those targets. And we started with the 11th COP Conference of Parties to the Convention in 2012 when India hosted it, when we had not only governments but also civil society organizations and private sector also committing themselves to contributing to realizing the Aichi global biodiversity targets. We had the Hyderabad pledges. We subsequently met during COP meetings. We made an assessment of the progress we've all been making, resulting in a set of commitments that parties have also made in Mexico when we met during the COP. And certainly the last COP in Egypt was landmark event in terms of countries gearing themselves in terms of assessing what we have done to achieve the ICT biodiversity targets, but also preparing for the next 10 years. All of this happened in the backdrop of not just governments or member states or parties to the convention doing significant amount of works towards conservation, but also civil society organizations, private sector, and a lot of other stakeholders contributing immensely to this. But in spite of it, our ability to go out to the world today and say that we have achieved several of those targets has been hampered. And to an extent, one of the reasons that was cited was that it's just not the intent of doing activities. It is not the number of commitments we have. It's not the kind of pledges that we have made for ourselves. But one question which also came about when I co-authored an assessment along with a colleague of mine, Mr. Christian Fripp from the Fritjof Nansen Institute in 2018, we reviewed close to 160 national biodiversity strategies and action plans on how different they are in the post-2010 scenario compared to what they were before. One element that really struck us was how much the states are doing towards realizing the targets, but an equal amount and perhaps more is also happening in terms of activities by non-state actors, voluntary actions and voluntary commitments by a large number of stakeholders. And for various reasons, we still are struggling to actually find a proper methodology, a proper framework on how do we count all of these actions together with the activities and the achievements made by the parties to the convention or the member states to the event. So in that backdrop, we intently listen to the outcomes of the 30th of September UN General Assembly Biodiversity Summit. We had 76 heads of state and governments pledging not just their intent to transform this planet for better nature conservation, but also committing themselves that the world will be different and safer and healthier as and when we run towards 2030. In preparation for it, a lot of countries, a lot of regions, including, for example, the European Union, started looking at how do we translate these commitments into some things which are measurable, which could be assessed, where the contributions of a larger number of stakeholders can equally be importantly considered as and when we are doing a global assessment of what we have done or what we have not done for biodiversity conservation. So this webinar comes in that backdrop where today we are going to be hearing to a set of global experts, and I'll introduce the panel in a minute, who would be actually providing us a little bit of a background to some of these issues, not only from a context of how some of these ideas have come about or how they are shaping up, but how some of these things can also contribute into the future, 2021 to 2030, where we can have a much larger framework for realizing our commitments that we are making already as a part of the global biodiversity framework, where the states and the non-state actors will work hand in hand in terms of supporting and promoting the conservation and development agenda. So that's basically the background or the rationale of having this particular virtual session. And to speak about some of those issues, we have set up 6 eminent speakers. We have Ms. Caterina Santamaria, who is a special advisor to the Office of the Executive Secretary of the Convention on Biological Diversity. And none of us need to sort of say the importance of the convention and the Secretariat in terms of shaping this agenda. And Caterina actually comes with more than 20 years of work experience working on the issues at global level, both in terms of policy and implementation. And in her role as a special advisor, she is intimately involved in the ongoing discussions and negotiations on shaping the post-2020 biodiversity framework. So thank you very much, Caterina, for joining us, because all the eyes today are on the convention in terms of trying to find out what is that you are going to be providing to us using the guidance provided by the contracting parties to the Secretariat. So it's brilliant to have you, and we look forward to hearing from you on some of the ongoing discussions and the emerging issues. We also have Ms. Marina Weissenberg, who is a senior ministerial advisor in charge for international biodiversity and environmental affairs at the Ministry of Environment in Finland. She's also the national focal point for the convention, and she also represents at the SABSTA Bureau, the scientific body on scientific, technical, and technological advice. She also was the chair of the Working Group on International Environmental Issues when Finland held the presidency for European Union recently. And she also served as the vice president for IUCN. And of course, Marina is an old hand in the convention process and brings very many different perspectives, not into the history of how we decided on the IC targets, but how the region and how we should be looking into the future of the global biodiversity framework as well. Welcome, Marina, and thank you very much for joining us. We have Ms. Rita L. Zotwal, who actually is the coordinator and the Costa Rica's focal point for a very, very important coalition, an international coalition that actually is being co-chaired by Costa Rica and France, called the High Ambition Coalition, whose mandate is to work with governments, is to work on ensuring that this planet will have much larger areas for conservation. So many of you would have heard of the 30% allocation of area for conservation purpose. And most importantly, this particular vision of the High Ambition Coalition is something which is reflected, it was reflected very heavily when we heard to the UN Secretary General and also the heads of state pledges and commitments in September 2020. So thank you very much, Rita, for joining us. And she is from Costa Rica. We have Adil Fado, who actually is a colleague of Rita, who also co-pilots the Secretariat of the High Ambition Coalition representing France. And she is a policy officer focusing on the Convention on Biological Diversity with the Directorate of European International Affairs with the French Ministry of Environment in France. Welcome, Adele, and thank you again for joining us. We have Mr. Ton van der Zon, who actually is having enormous experience of work on the ground. He has been an expert working with national parks. He has been national parks planner in many countries. He also served as the biodiversity expert with the Dutch Ministry of Foreign Affairs. He was in charge for the Energy and Climate Change Program at the Dutch Development Cooperation Agency, and currently is a researcher at Naturalist Biodiversity Center in Leiden. And we also have Ronaldo Morales, who is from Peru, but currently living in USA with the University of Madison in Wisconsin, University of Wisconsin in Madison. And Ronaldo focuses on issues of the role of indigenous people and local communities on various elements of environmental management, including biodiversity conservation, human rights, the ability of IP of the indigenous peoples and local communities to actually make a change from local to global biodiversity issues. So we have 6 brilliant speakers who are a part of this panel. And the way we would like to organize this panel for a change to be a little bit interactive is that we will not have any PowerPoint presentation from the panelists, but each of them will respond to a set of trigger questions with which we'll be starting this particular session. The participants, you're most welcome to put your comments and questions in the chat box. We'll try to collate them. And in the second round of our discussions today, we will take up some of those comments and questions and seek responses from the panelists. So I'll start with Catalina Santamaria. As I said, Catalina, the convention secretary is working overtime. I'm sure all of you are really working extremely hard, not just to shape the post-2020 global biodiversity framework, but you are also keeping your ears and eyes open in terms of a lot of emerging ideas, a lot of emerging issues that are coming in. To look at how do we implement this framework as and when the framework gets adopted, when we are going to be meeting in CBD COP15, which is hopefully in 2021. So may I ask you, from the Secretariat perspective, given your experience and background on some of these issues, what are the key takeaways you will have from the UN Summit on Biodiversity, and how important they are in terms of pushing the boundaries for the new global framework for conservation, but also how important they are for the implementation of this framework once the framework gets adopted in CBD COP15. Catalina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Bala. I hope you can hear me well, and a good day to everyone. It's great to have so many people participating at this webinar, and I deeply thank, on behalf of Elizabeth Maremma, the Executive Secretary of the CBD Convention, to Earthmind for organizing this webinar. And to begin, in view of your question, I want to be very clear that in our view, the recent and also past pledges and commitments have been very important to the process. In particular, the high-level commitments that were announced last month during the UNGA Biodiversity Summit have shown transformations not only to embrace a systems view for nature, for our planet, and for people, but also to optimize shifts in different sectors of society for a sustainable future. And specific to the Biodiversity Summit, there were a record number of countries, heads of state, in the amounts of 150 countries participating, 72 heads of state and government at this event on the 30th of September. And such outcomes, in our view, have raised and really provided the impetus from a political level to raise the visibility of biodiversity at a very important milestone in history, where countries have been celebrating the 75th anniversary of the United Nations. The summit clearly addressed the urgency, the ambition, and the unity needed to halt and reverse the rate of nature loss, and to raise ambition towards the adoption of the new global biodiversity framework. And there were very direct commitments by heads of state in support of the CBD COP15 to be held next year. Mainly this in respect to a bold and strong post-2020 global biodiversity framework. And in this context, we have seen that heads of state recognize the suite of issues pertinent to the discussions under the CBD. Heads of state noted warning signals on future interconnected risks, with specific references to COVID-19, human health, and biodiversity. The mainstreaming of biodiversity in all sectors of the economy was also stressed, together with activities to leverage solutions that conserve and sustainably use nature to address climate change and biodiversity through, for example, activities that related to strengthening laws, policies, and actions on biodiversity at all levels, factoring nature in all decision-making, investing in nature, and rebuilding economies in a nature-positive manner. And this among many other points, which remind us of our relationship with nature and relate very profoundly with the science-based findings from the IPBES reports from 2019, and also the Global Biodiversity Outlook 5th edition that was launched this September. So in this context, there is a link between the pledges and commitments of the heads of state just recently this year and the process that is moving forward and shaping the global biodiversity framework. How this will be translated into the post-2020 process will indeed require further analysis and continued dialogue, especially in view of the formal processes that are in subsequent shape for the next SEPSTA and SBI meetings. I think it's also very relevant, as you pointed, Dr. Bala, that we take note also of the transformative commitments among other actors. And during the UNGA summit, there were specific platforms for stakeholder groups, including the private sector. And one example is, in fact, during the UNGA, there was the Voices for Nature, a virtual event that really brought in a multitude of different stakeholders, as well as the Nature for Life Hub that also took place on the margins of the summit. And these events captured inspiring commitments filled with informative content and modalities to accelerate meaningful actions for real-world impact. The broader stakeholder action agenda is also a significant part of this whole picture that we are striving for in this new decade of action of 2020-2030. And this is key to build traction on biodiversity with a broader public across all sectors through inclusivity, shared solutions, and meaningful impact. And we believe that this action agenda would be a strong asset where society can realize that they also play a critical part in helping to solve the biodiversity crisis and see that this issue of biodiversity as a priority issue for the world to face. As a non-negotiating space, the action agenda aims to showcase commitments that give confidence to the process and helps grow the drumbeat to COP15 and beyond in terms of implementation and support for countries in their more formal commitments. And so while we build on this momentum, we believe there are further steps that we need to take to support the formal process, and those are underway through the open-ended working group discussions and through the SEPSTAs and SBIs that are to come. And at the same time, we feel it's important to further address the points that were coming out of decision 1434 in COP14 on voluntary national commitments, as per that paragraph in the decision 1434, paragraph 11, as well as further paragraphs on non-state actor commitments through the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming Action Agenda for Nature and People. With that, thank you, and I look forward to the discussions.
Thank you, Santa Maria. Very crisp, very focused, and of course, the key point that you mentioned, which is definitely a point of interest for all of us in this particular session, but also subsequently, would be those two words you mentioned, working together. You know, that's basically the spirit as and when we are moving forward towards not just adopting, but also implementing the post-2020 framework. So I'd like to now invite Marina. Marina, actually you, as I mentioned, has been a very, very important negotiator, a key negotiator with enormous experience. I mean, you have seen the discussions that happened in The Hague when we were there, where we adopted the 2002 to 2010 targets, then subsequently in Nagoya 2011 to 2020, and now you are part in thick of discussions for the post-2020 framework. But most importantly, you are also one of those negotiators, colleagues, individuals who actually for long have seen translating that element of working together into action on the ground. And that's why I distinctly remember during the presidency of Finland, when we had the meeting in Brussels, we actually focused very specifically on the issue of commitments. How do we're not looking at formalizing the commitments, but we are looking at how do we measure the commitments? How do we make people also feel responsible that it is not just a political statement, but there is also something that needs to be done on the ground to translate the commitment or the pledge to action. So I'd like to hear from you, personal perspective with your experience, but also as a member state, as a party to the convention, where you see this entire discussion of one, commitments being translated into action and measuring those commitments over a period of time, because otherwise we only will have commitments on paper. And secondly, how do we sort of reconcile? How do we sort of ensure this working together that Santa Maria mentioned in terms of contributing to the implementation or realizing the post-2020 framework? Marina, you have the floor.
Thank you, Dr. Bala, and thank you to all of you to arranging Earthmind this event. I hope you can hear me fine.
Yes.
If not, thank you. First of all, I just want to say that this timing of this meeting is also excellent because last Friday, and Catalina also mentioned the Leaders' Pledge for Nature, and the commitment made where we have, I think, some 78, almost 80 countries now, engaged from the state of head of state level. And I think that's really excellent news. But also last Friday, the EU Ministers of Environment adopted the EU Council conclusion on the EU Biodiversity Strategy, which maybe, in my opinion, is one of the most concrete proposals for bending the curve or halting biodiversity loss in different sectors as well, which I think is really important that we made it. And the ambition level of that strategy is tough, and it will also, I think, hopefully make the needed transformative change that we are looking for. And we could not have done that without the pressure and without the cooperation with the scientific community, with academia, with youth, with the education field, and of course, I just want to say that it has been a pleasure since 2019 to have the IPBES report in hand, and also now the Global Biodiversity Outlook, but also the Local Biodiversity Outlook, because I think without the NGOs and the stakeholders, quite strong voice, we could not have made that successful outcome from last Friday on the ministerial level. That says, I mean, what that means is that it's for the sake of biodiversity, we will protect old-growth forest, we will change our agriculture practices to ban, pesticides. We will increase our protected areas until 30%, 30 by 30, something which Finland is a member of this HAC, and we are really happy about that. That was also something that was in the Leaders' Pledge. That said, what I think is where we are moving is that we will have something alike like the climate and Paris Agreement about 1.5 degrees or 2 degrees in the convention. That's what I hope for, because what we need is that the communication is really, it's really an important part of this, and we need to have the messages clear. That also said that the communication is also a very important part of the knowledge generation, the awareness raising, and the behavioral change that we are looking for, and also for the mainstreaming. So then when we talk about these commitments, where do we in the convention, what are the mechanisms or tools that we can use? And you mentioned it, Dr. Bala, yourself, but one of the key elements is to transform these commitments as well in the National Biodiversity Strategy and Action Plans. And that, of course, will be needed now after the, should we say, Nature Pact or New Deal for Nature, or whatever you call it when we have the COP15. So we need to translate these commitments in the NBSAPs, and we need also to have some kind of rationing mechanism. I mean, if the commitment is done in 2-3 years, I think there needs to be a review and a checkup if we could then strengthen these. And these can be done, of course, not only on the government level, but by the private sector, by the NGOs. But what I would like to see, and I think that has still been missing, you mentioned Sylvia, Hyderabad commitments. a lot of commitments has been done under the convention already, but there is no coordinating mechanism in the CBD, nor in the UNEP helping us or anywhere else that is looking into this, that are we following these commitments? And I think this is really, really important in the future. So, and here also, that's something which I think is needed for the future. I also would like to say that there are, with regard to these commitments, and what I'm saying about this mechanism is that we need to have some kind of accountability. If we have made a commitment, also the Leaders' Pledge, by the way, includes 10 promises or commitments, and I think that needs to be followed up. What are the parties doing with regard to these commitments? So I think this is one issue which I would like to leave as a message here, and maybe Earthmind, IUCN, UNEP, WCMC, I don't know which entity could get the resources to be a third party to look into these commitments. And then also to say that this High Ambition Coalition, there are a few of them out there. One is this 30 by 30, but then we also have another one where Finland is also very actively, my government is involved, and that has to do with the commitment for oceans. The marine biodiversity is one example where we need to do much more. And in fact, when we look into the zero draft of the post-2020 new global biodiversity framework, the marine element is still very weak. I think I leave this as messages, but something on these commitments needs to be, in my opinion, structurally done. Otherwise, we lose, I think, the ownership for all the efforts that has been done, and also to follow up them. And the NBSUPS is one of the key elements on national level. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Marina. I think some very valid and useful points, especially in terms of how do we measure the commitments in terms of translating them into actions on the ground and the impacts. We may now request Ms. Rita on behalf of the High Ambition Coalition, because Rita, a lot of us today are looking towards the High Ambition Coalition, because one is that it has put in place a set of high ambition target of protecting 30% of the planet by 2030. But you also are able to now muster enough support. You're able to inspire a lot of countries, a lot of governments who actually look at setting such kind of a high ambition target in terms of achieving what we would like to achieve. Because for those of us who are a part of the negotiation or the CBD processes, when we started discussing the current Aichi biodiversity targets, one of the first rounds of discussions was to actually stop any biodiversity loss, because countries wanted to really have an extremely high ambitious goal of stopping biodiversity loss. Of course, a lot of scientists came and said, no, you can't do it, because biodiversity loss to a certain extent is also an evolutionary phenomena. So we have to reduce the rate of loss. That's how we even got the language both in The Hague, and after that, reducing the rate of loss of biodiversity kind of. But from the High Ambition Coalition, a little bit of a perspective on what is the coalition about and what you intend to do, but also how do you see the High Ambition Coalition contributing to translating some of these pledges into action on the ground? Rita?
Thank you, Bala. Thank you so much. And I wish to start by thanking Earthmind for inviting me to be part of this panel today. It is really my honor to share with you some of the work that we've been doing within the High Ambition Coalition. And for some of you that don't know about the coalition is an interregional group of countries, of 34 countries, that has the specific goal of achieving 30% of protection of land and ocean by 2030. We have been working since last year, actually, because the coalition was first mentioned by the president of Costa Rica during the United Nations Climate Summit last year. And we have been working since then together with France as co-chairs of the coalition. With regards to your question, Bala, on the different pledges and the different commitments that have been put forward since the United Nations Biodiversity Summit. For instance, it was mentioned before the Leaders Pledge, which was basically, it came in as a result of the discussions of more than and the agreement of more than 78 countries that came together and that step up the global ambition for biodiversity, nature, climate, and people. And this kind of pledges also is in support to all the work that we have been doing, because what we have been trying to do is to put nature in the front and to raise awareness on all the work that we've been doing so far. So besides the pledge that was also made, there was also the Nature Finance Forum during the United Nations Biodiversity Summit around those dates, in which many countries also came on board, such as Germany, Costa Rica, the UK, Canada. Also, the business sector was in this Nature Finance Forum, and philanthropists came together and made this financial pledge and announced commitment for nature finance. So there are, and as Marina was saying, there are so many different commitments and so many different pledges coming forward, and this is very encouraging, but we have to see a way in which, as a coalition, we can support all the different elements that are happening. And as such, we as a coalition, we are working to see how we can translate our efforts within two different tracks. So I wanted to share with you that within the coalition, we are working on a political track, and we are also working on a technical track. With regards to the political track, we are trying to put the light, spread the light and the focus on the importance of protecting and on the importance of putting biodiversity in the front lines of our discussion at the highest level. So we are trying to have this political track in which we gather more support to protection and also to the post-2020 framework as a whole. Also, within the coalition, we're working on the technical aspect, because we know that if we only talk about this political commitments, we have to translate them in some way to more efficient and tangible results. And that's what we're trying to do within the coalition, to work on the technical aspects as well, and to move forward as a coalition with a very concrete language and very concrete narrative as a coalition to really achieve an ambitious post-2020 framework. So I think that the hack for nature and people, it's really about putting this political willingness, which will be translated into specific commitments and language in the negotiation. And this will foster in securing the adoption of the 30 by 30 target and achieving a post-2020 framework. We believe that we have a lot of work moving forward, and we really need to find a way in which we coordinate our different efforts. As Marina was mentioning, there's also the Global Ocean Alliance that we are very much coordinating together and seeing how we can really try to work in this dialogue and in this synergies between the different coalitions that are happening and the different initiatives. We know that and as the scientist has been telling us, we have this gap of we have this opportunity of 10 years moving forward, and we need to try to capitalize our efforts to work collectively towards our goals. We know that we have 10 years to achieve the SDGs, the Sustainable Development Agenda in 2030. We have 10 years for the completion of the Climate Accord, the Paris Accord. So we know that we have to really come together and see how we can foster our collective efforts, and this is precisely what we're trying to do within the coalition. So I'm very happy to share with you that we are doing our best in seeking ways in which we can really try to talk with the different actors that are pushing forward those initiatives and those ambitions, and trying to see how we can translate this into commitments and really achieve an ambitious post-2020 framework. Thank you, Bala. I look forward for the interactive session.
Thank you, Rita. I think very useful, because at least it gives a little bit of a background to the High Ambition Coalition. But certainly I'll get back to you. I can keep thinking in terms of not just you, but also the other panelists, in terms of what are the lessons we have learned from having a similar kind of commitment we have made for climate change. Because the entire idea also emanated to a certain extent from our either successes or failures with climate change actions. So certainly that'll be an issue for us to also briefly touch upon as and when we are discussing in this particular meeting. Adil, of course, France definitely is taking a global leadership role on environmental issues. And certainly I very distinctly remember the leadership you have paid for IPBES, in the earlier iterations of IPBES, the IMOSEP process and all that kind of a thing. And of course, the president himself had called for having a global framework, a framework agreement on environment. And most importantly, you're also going to be hosting the World Conservation Congress. One thing settling in terms of the current pandemic. So certainly, France is sitting on kind of a position where you are now trying to coordinate, different kinds of not just actions, but also different kinds of strategies, different kinds of, pledges, different kinds of intent that are actually coming together. But from your, experience, from your perspective, how do you see some of these kinds of initiatives coming together? Rita also mentioned about various other initiatives that are there, but certainly the outcomes of the Conservation Congress of IUCN is going to be a very, very important trigger in terms of how countries are going to be looking at some of these in the future. So I'd like to hear your thoughts on how you actually look at these elements of pledges, commitments, but also interlinking some of these things so that the action on the ground is more impactful.
Yes, thank you very much. I hope you can hear me well.
Yes.
Okay, perfect. So thank you. Yes, thank you very much, Bala, and I would like also to thank Earthmind for inviting me on this panel today. And so to answer your questions on interaction between states and non-state actors in the year 2021 to come, maybe I will start by saying that really the way we are seeing it is that roles are differentiated between states and non-state actors on how they can realize the global biodiversity goals, but synergies are really strong. Because on one side, states are at the forefront of the negotiations because the CDB is an intergovernmental process, and they have the responsibility to make sure that the future framework is fit for purpose with ambitious goals and targets, such as the 30 by 30 targets, with also relevant indicator, a robust implementation mechanism, and adequate enabling conditions such as resource mobilizations or capacity building. But non-state actors on the other side, they really have a power in influencing the process and push for ambition by showing that they are ready, committed, and that they want an ambitious outcome. And this is exactly what happened on the UNFCCC side at COP21 in Paris, where we had coalition of non-state actors establishing, and they really called on states to have an ambitious Paris Agreement by showing that they were already ready to implement it. So that's why we also believe that ensuring a powerful synergies between state and non-state actors will be instrumental to boost the implementation of the post-2020 framework, because that's no news for everyone that the timeframes of the states is a slow time frame. It usually takes time to update an MBSAP, to update a policy, to pass a law, or to enforce a regulation most of the time. But non-state actors are acting on the ground already, and they can be more flexible than states. They can already take measures to translate the principles and the targets of the post-2020 framework into actions. And also, as we need to make sure that the post-2020 framework is relevant at the local level and for local actors. So non-state actors will be key to do so. So what can states do is also to ensure that we organize high-level moments of discussions to really connect with non-state actors to catalyze ambition. The IUCN Congress, to us, will be one of them, and will be one of the key moments next year to do so, a key opportunity really to gather a wide network of relevant stakeholders and to really put targeted issues under the spotlight that will serve the COP on one side, but also global biodiversity goals and commitments on the other sides. And even if it's postponed, I really would like to ensure here that France remains committed to ensure that the Congress keeps its initial ambition, and we are really working with the IUCN towards that. We also have several other moments through the year where the interaction will be fostered between states and non-state actors. The One Planet Summit that was announced by the French President Emmanuel Macron will be one of them, and this is where we actually intend to launch the High Ambition Coalition. And there will also be the pre-COP15 in Colombia that we see as a moment that can catalyze both ambitions. In addition, we would like to say that what will determine really the success of the post-2020 framework is how fast and effectively it can be implemented. Rita was mentioning it, time is of the essence, and we have a decade to act. So therefore, we think that we need to think strategically on how to establish a mechanism that will reflect the contribution of non-state actors to the implementation of the framework. And this mechanism should also serve as a catalyzer for coalition buildings and projects to be launched. France really see coalitions as a very strong and useful tool that can connect state and non-state actors to have joint projects or joint advocacy. And they can also be of use to promote specific topic of importance. And this is what we are doing with the High Ambition Coalition by launching a coalition to really promote one specific target and one specific vision. These coalitions, for instance, they have been very helpful if you look at the Paris agreements for implementing some key sectoral issues such as transport, decarbonization, buildings, agriculture, and so on. We believe that for the CDB, this could be replicated and it could be based on what has already been done with the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming action agenda that was established at COP15. And we believe that this action agenda is really of uttermost importance, and it's an effective tool for engaging and federating a various number of actors. And we believe that it could be strengthened and adequately linked up to the post-2020 global biodiversity framework. We also believe that it can be, for instance, very useful, the action agenda to reflect on the mainstreaming components, because the mainstreaming requires the commitment and adhesion of a great number of stakeholders. So the action agenda could be a catalyzer to do so. And as also Marina was mentioning, it can feed also into a potential global stocktake or ratchet mechanisms that are envisaged in the discussions of the implementation mechanism of the post-2020 framework. So therefore, and I will conclude here, we really need to have a dedicated framework to ensure these strong synergies between state and non-state actors, to ensure that they will be translated into concrete action, contributing to realize the post-2020 framework and the global biodiversity goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Adele. Very, very important and very sort of forceful points in terms of the need to work together. Again, as I mentioned, Catalina mentioned it in her intervention, that working together is important, especially between state and non-state actors, and we'll definitely listen to a few more inputs. But at this point, we actually are shifting the gear and we'll focus on what the non-state actors are also doing. So far, we've heard of what the countries are doing, what the parties have committed to themselves, what kind of commitments, what kind of coalitions are being put in place. But we'll have two panelists who will be focusing on what others are doing, what the non-state actors are doing. One from research and academic community, the people who actually are on the ground, but also the other speaker, Ronaldo, who will be speaking about the role of indigenous people and local communities. But at this point, I'd like to ask Tom, who actually have had that experience of working on the ground as a national parks planning expert, but currently also serving as an auditor for an initiative of Earthmind called the Voluntary Conservation Areas. In terms of his views, his experience and ideas on how do we ensure that the actions, enormous number of actions that are being done by some of these stakeholder groups, some of these colleagues who have contributed immensely to our actions towards conservation agenda, on what is that we can learn from some of those actions. Tom, you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you, Bala. Thanks also to Earthmind for inviting me in the panel. I was very much involved in the early years of the convention with the negotiation and the early COPs. And afterwards, working a lot in the field, I noticed the big difference of the language being used in the convention and the language of the being used in the field. And it is really a challenge to get the private sector and to get the people in the field involved and involved in the conservation. Most of the pledges under the convention are being done by governments, but most of the land area, but also the marine area, but we are mainly talking about land area, are outside the protected areas. And they are being managed by the private sector, by companies, by communities. And it is very important to really try to get them involved. And how could we get how could we engage these sectors in the conservation of the biodiversity? Under the voluntary conservation areas program, I'm an independent auditor to see how private sector and other sector are doing their conservation. What I said already is that it is important to get those people really involved in the discussions about the conservation of biodiversity. And we should not do that with rules and with targets, but we should try to experiment very much their voluntary involvements. And then even the lowest ambitions for the conservation of biodiversity are very important. Once people are involved, we could try to step up their ambitions. So first start to discuss with the people and to get them involved, and then later on we can get them much further involved. What is important, of course, is that the pledges of the private people, the private sector, the companies, the communities, that the pledges are transparent and that they are accountable and that it are not only intentions. And in the VCA process, the Voluntary Conservation Areas process, we want the companies to register their efforts. They should come up with a management plan. The management plan should have a baseline, should really express the ambitions, and should also be clear in the measures. And what is very important is that it should be an independent verification, and that is where I come in as an independent auditor. And then what is important in the VCA is their register. There is a register of all the ambitions of the private sector. And that, in fact, what should be done under the CBD also is to have a worldwide register where the VCA can contribute to. I'd like to illustrate the VCA process with 4 examples from the fields. Let me start with an example from the Netherlands, the bee landscape. Quite a few partners took the initiative to work on the improvement of the biodiversity with the bees, most the honeybees as well as the wild bees, as key species. Municipalities, the province, the water boards, the Heineken brewery, and also farmers went together and they said, we'd like to protect or to stimulate the biodiversity in a large area of the densely populated western part of the Netherlands, an area of 22,000. And they made a management plan. I audited the management plan, and what for me was very important is to see their ambitions and to follow their ambitions also, to see that from the baselines they made, they're really increasing the biodiversity. So, and up till now, more and more people, more and more farmers and other private sector people get attached to that initiative. A second example is in Spain, in Andalusia. There's a large altiplano in the mountains, and 1 million hectares of altiplano have been modified for the last years into a monoculture of almond trees and olive trees, and the biodiversity is disappearing. In the past there used to be a lot of steppe birds, which for whom the cereals are very important, but the farmers were not interested anymore in cereals and changed their fields to almonds. An association of farmers, of business people, of researchers and municipalities came together and said we should try to restore the biodiversity of the huge area again. There are a lot of villages and towns, altogether with 250,000 inhabitants in that 1 million hectares. But together they try to improve the biodiversity by a diversification of the crops, by interlining the almond trees, by reforestation, by all kinds of activities. And that is going quite well. They are getting back quite some species that were lost already. A third example I like to mention is in Peru. There is an area in San Martin, in the Amazonia, where a group of coffee farmers went together and said, we'd like to conserve the biodiversity of our farms, and part of the farm still consists of good rainforest. It is an area of 7,000 hectares. They made last year a management plan, and they put down all kinds of ambitions on the paper, and I will follow their ambitions in the coming years and see that they will really improve the biodiversity. And then, and to just illustrate the diversity of the initiatives, there's a small area of 2 hectares in the southern part of the Netherlands. A group of house owners bought a piece of land, a piece of old agricultural land, and they built their houses on it, but they said, we'd like to improve the biodiversity, to restore and improve the biodiversity of the area. They made a management plan, and they're really investing a lot to improve the area. So in the VCA area, you can have small initiatives, you can have large initiatives, but the important thing is to really put things on paper, the ambitions, and to have the independent verification of the process. And so that is what I think also important for the CBD process. Just try to really get the field examples in the process. And one of the initiatives is the VCA initiative, and build that out to a worldwide register of all kinds of private sector initiatives. Thank you.
Thanks a lot, Tom. Thank you very much. Very useful, and certainly your examples, even though they're elaborate, very, very sort of important in terms of driving home one point is that there is so much that is happening on the ground, whether it is from the civil society organizations, the local communities, the private sector. But to an extent, we all the time are challenged by how do we count such actions? How do we measure such actions and see how they contribute to the overall conservation agenda? I will now hear from Ronaldo in terms of the perspectives from the indigenous and local communities. Of course, Ronaldo, you've been working in this area for many years, and wherever we turn in terms of the role and contributions of indigenous and local communities, we are always told it is very important. They actually manage such large areas of land, to the percent of the land area globally. But we still are challenged by the fact that how do we count such actions when we are looking at realizing or not realizing some of these ambitions and goals? Ronaldo, over to you.
Thank you. I've been also part of the IIFB at COP14 at Sharm el Sheikh, and lately part of the indigenous delegations that attended the Conference of Protected Areas of Latin America and Caribbean, and being part also in last December before the COVID started, in a platform of countries that in South America that are considered now centers of origin for biodiversity and agriculture, claiming a different sets of conditions for the protection of their genetic resources. The first point that I would like to address is how IPLCs are implementing an agenda that is based on long-standing commitments. And a good reference is the Global Biodiversity Outlook, the version 5 that has been recently released in 2020, that provides a global summary of progress on promoting biodiversity, as well as evidence of growing biodiversity crisis and the urgent need of action. These Outlook provide an assessment of over 50 indigenous and community authors that contributed, providing their perspectives and experiences in the assessment of progress in global biodiversity goals. This important release has been part of also of crucial negotiations during towards a post-2020 global biodiversity framework. Also they assess the progress against all 20 of the Aichi targets, which characterize global ambitions between 2011 and 2020. The last assessment, the most important assessment, is a contribution of indigenous peoples and local communities have been too often neglected and marginalized, and that failure to recognize and support these contributions is directly tied to our global failure to meet the majority of them. In particular, the Aichi Target 14, which established the capacity of ecosystems to provide essential services in which societies depend, continues to decline, and consequently most ecosystem services are in decline. So this target has not been achieved by this biodiversity outlook assessment. The Aichi Target 15, which is the progress towards the target of restoring 15% of degraded ecosystems by 2020, has not been either achieved. The Target 16, the implementation of the Nagoya Protocol and ABS mechanisms, has been partially achieved, but as we have seen and discussed, the emergence of digital sequence information technologies represent a major challenge to the Nagoya Protocol. The Target 18 also has not been achieved, which is despite an increased recognition of the value of traditional knowledge and customary sustainable use, both in global policy and in scientific community, has not been achieved. And this is an important conclusion. More in Target 19 on science-based technologies and knowledge integration processes that involve indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge, as well as a Target 20 about increases in domestic resources for biodiversity in some countries, have been partially achieved. The second point that I would like to take is the role of IPLCs in realizing global biodiversity pledges made on 30 September at the UN General Assembly. The most important sources for the IPLCs situation related to these global biodiversity pledges are the latest ILO 169 World Report released in 2019, and the Global Summary of Progress towards the Aichi Biodiversity Targets, and the IPBES Global Assessment of Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services released also this year, that it was just in some parts devastating. There's an emphasis on all these sources about the role of protected areas and agroecology and development of green jobs, training and mentoring neighboring communities, green entrepreneurship. And for these goals, we also have seen the pledges that relate to IPLCs, indigenous peoples and local communities, in terms of their stewardship, emphasizing community dialogue, along with the role of natural diversity in sustainable development and natural resource management. Also, the follow-up, the global petition asking the UN to adopt the Declaration of the Rights of Mother Earth to complement the Human Rights Declaration. The strengthening of the capacity building and ecosystem and environmental services involving IPLCs, to create a more resilient and resource efficient world post-COVID-19, which has been devastating for many indigenous communities. Propose a new framework of international cooperation for living in harmony with nature post-2020, and the need of strengthening the integration of the role of indigenous peoples and local communities at the level of stakeholder engagement. This is a very important thing. Other pledges are related to connect global biodiversity with plant genetic resources, conservation and use of food, agriculture, and we have been specifically studying the possible implementation of community seed banks across the world, especially in indigenous communities, in local communities, to design, carry out, consult and lobby master plans, programmers, projects, as well as actions, evaluations, and indicators in plant genetic resources. And this relates also with the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People study, championing a global deal for nature and people that can stop the loss of species and protect vital ecosystems. However, I see a key omission in the High Ambition Coalition, as the proposed leadership is based on the preeminence of reliances on science, when we have been seeing that in all the convention language in this course, indigenous knowledge and traditional knowledge systems were key and are key to the management of natural resources, with much better results in many cases than Western science alone itself. So different knowledge systems, in our experience, refer to different accountabilities and commitments for different actors, and relate in the specific indigenous context in the affirmation of land rights and governance. So as CBD has been specific in recognizing IPLCs as strategic partners, I see an important opportunity to highlight this recognition and inclusion. Finally, what we can learn from IPLC's area-based conservation measures are the new release of the guidelines of recognizing and reporting other effective area conservation measures, OECMs, at the 24th meeting of the CBD's, subsidiary body on scientific, technological, and technological advice in Montreal. So OECMs are defined as geographically defined areas other than protected areas, governed and managed in ways that achieve positive and sustained long-term outcomes for in situ conservation of biodiversity with associated ecosystem functions and services, and where applicable, cultural, spiritual, socioeconomic, and other locally relevant values. So we see that even the importance of this new tool is that even that other effective area-based conservation measures may be managed according to many different objectives, they must anyway to deliver effective conservation and manage conservation as a primary or secondary objective. This is a significant opportunity to recognize effective long-term conservation taking place outside of currently designated protected areas by a diverse set of actors. And some of the positive conservation outcomes previewed by these new framework are conserving important ecosystems, habitats, and wildlife corridors, supporting the recovery of threatened species, maintaining ecosystem functionings and securing ecosystem services, enhancing resilience against threats, and retaining and connecting remnants of fragmented ecosystems with developed landscape. To end this summary, I think that it is important to acknowledge that a main challenge of this new framework is the duality about the participation of indigenous peoples and local communities in global biodiversity discourse, as they have historically managed most of the Earth biodiversity, and to actually include them, their self-determining governance systems through the application of free, prior, and informed consent as mechanisms to ensure that they are equal partners in research, decision-making, and implementation of these guidelines in ways that it strengthens indigenous people's governance systems and capacities to promote that these rights are recognized, that indigenous people's rights are recognized by all national legislations to allow them to participate as legitimate partners in the fulfillment of the global SDGs. And
I think that sort of brings us close to the first round of interventions. Thank you very much. And certainly, as all of you have heard the panelists speak, we have initiatives, we have ideas, we have the intent, we have the commitments, we have the pledges, and we also seem to have the will of the negotiators to bring all of these together. So to me, listening to the interventions and also going through some of the comments and inputs that we have received from the participants, I think it is time for us to connect the dots. A lot of things are already happening. A lot of things are already there. And three key points are emerging. Of course, the inputs from the participants include, for example, there are a lot of non-state actors who are doing it. Assessment has already been done, and the colleagues there actually shared that information. There's a lot of initiatives that are happening at the local level. For example, in India, we have the provincial and the local level biodiversity boards that are working very, very hard in terms of translating some of these issues. But three elements actually seem to be coming up repeatedly. One, what kind of a coordination mechanism we should have in place so that some of these activities, some of the initiatives, some of these stakeholders can work together. And of course, the moment we are talking of a coordination mechanism, as Marina also mentioned in her intervention, we are also looking at two elements of the coordination mechanism. A mechanism which actually can be effective, can deliver, but also the activities or the outcomes of the mechanism that can be measured. The second one is to have the mechanism operate on a framework which is transparent and which is also accountable. I think that is where we need to sort of reconcile in terms of our intent to translate these pledges into action on the ground, but also ensure that all the stakeholder groups will have a very important role to play in realizing this. So I'd like to quickly, not more than a minute for each of the panelists to respond to some of these points in terms of, is there a way in which we can, look at the possibility of coming up with a coordination mechanism? Of course, timeline is going to be a challenge in terms of whether it is possible in CBD 15 or it should be after that. How do we deal with the transparency and the accountability element of it? And thirdly, and most importantly, given the spread of initiatives and activities that are already there, what kind of mechanism should we put in place to capture some of those results and some of those actions, so that when we are counting our actions towards achieving the goals, we are more comprehensive and we are more complete. So I'd like to give the floor to Catalina. Of course, her own individual expertise or experience in working on these issues, but also sitting and listening to what is emerging from the negotiations and discussions within the convention in terms of the possibility of a coordination mechanism, in terms of coming up with something, which could count things that need to be counted. Catalina.
Thank you, Dr. Vala, and thank you to everyone who has provided their views. I think it has been extremely insightful, a lot of alignment in what the Secretary is also thinking, and really helpful to hear from all the different countries, but also non-state actors to see how we can really provide some options for the parties in terms of this important point moving forward in the post-2020 work. And I want to highlight some of the points that Adele mentioned, because I think it was very interesting and very useful to make that distinction of the roles of the parties as an intergovernmental process, their compliance towards the convention articles, and the more formalized processes in reporting and accountability, which are under discussion currently in the post-2020. So of course we cannot already expect to know what the results of that is because there is a negotiation that is taking place. So we have to be very respectful and mindful of the process moving forward through the political and the formal process. On the other hand, though, I think the experience of France with the Paris Agreement is really helpful for us to see how similar steps were taken in the context of understanding the connection and synergies between parties in the formal process and non-state actors in a role that is very important, yet one to which provides more advocacy, provides solutions, examples in different contexts, and in many ways in a voluntary, non-binding manner. And while non-binding, still very important. And I think that that was the intention towards the outcome of COP14 with the presidencies of Egypt and the incoming presidency of China to announce an initiative known as the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming Action Agenda for Nature and People, to really provide that as a mechanism, as an informal mechanism initiative that the presidencies wanted to offer within the interim of 2018 to 2020 and now 2021 for the next COP. And I think that to answer the question, that could be a very interesting coordination mechanism. That is something that is available through the party's decision in decision 1434, with some aspects of the scope in terms of language on inviting different stakeholders, including indigenous people and local communities, local authorities, the private sector, youth, and many others that make and form a very important part in the convention's work. And also describing the timing and the type of commitments and the role, the objective of what those type of commitments are to perform. And in that context, the paragraph notes that it's more of providing support and contributing to the post-2020 framework. So we have a scope, and that's what prompted the Secretariat to build and set up a platform on the Sharm el-Sheikh to Kunming Action Agenda with inputs from different stakeholders as well as from different UN agencies, and starting to build that, to which we are very interested to welcome other views to strengthen. And I think, again, this goes to the point of the importance of coalitions that exist or new interest groups, or including the voluntary conservation areas that are currently under Earthmind's organization. These are all different type of activities that we can really look at how they can play a part for the effectiveness and the delivery and the measurement that we're seeking as a next phase to offer to the parties, so that the parties can take a decision as to whether this type of mechanism is beneficial to the role and the pathway, the blueprint that will be coming out of the post-2020 framework. I think it's also very important that that currently what we have on the action agenda is an informal platform. It is looking for voluntary contributions, and it is really trying to provide a role for engagement. As Ronaldo has mentioned, it's important to ensure that we are inclusive. We're trying to engage with all types of actors in a way that benefits the parties and benefits this new era in 2020, 2030 to achieve towards a measurable, successful outcome in the next 10 years. I think that in the elements that will be critical for such a mechanism, yes, we do need it to be transparent. And currently we have been posting all commitments that have been received to the Sharm el-Sheikh Action Agenda on our website. We are looking at new ways to ensure accountability in a phased manner, in which case we have some ideas that will be presented in the upcoming meetings of SUBSTA and SBI, to which will allow some options for consideration of how, in a soft way, we can inform parties and many others in the CBD community about who is first responding and providing commitments. How are those commitments aligned to the transition points that the Global Biodiversity Outlook fifth report have indicated as critical for us to address the implementation gap and to improve national ambition as we move forward in this decade? We're also trying to look at ways that we can measure progress in such a way that it's more towards not achieving the target, because the targets haven't been defined, but that we're able to inform of steps being taken that are looking at the drivers of biodiversity loss, that are looking at the areas of mainstreaming to which we know are critical, and that we have mandates from COP13 and 14 to really engage and work with new sectors. And we are also looking at ways that we can bring innovation, we can bring new solutions, new ideas that could be very helpful for different parties to connect and to work together. And in that context, find a way that in future meetings of the CBD, we can report in informal, soft manner, maybe through information notes of what is happening in this space of the non-state actor action agenda. Of course, we are very much interested in hearing from the parties and interested in hearing from the non-state actors to see how best we can work together to make this structure and mechanism as most agile, as most meaningful and effective for the scope and the purpose of supporting the post-2020 process. I think from that perspective, I do want to make note of the fact that there are many different actors that have been very much providing input and helping to frame this mechanism in the most beneficial manner. And I think that it does merit further discussions that we can bring through parties, given the fact that from a process point of view, procedural point of view, it'd be quite useful to have a decision coming out of the COP15 to understand what the direction is in terms of these of this platform in the future. And I believe that in the climate context, the Marrakesh platform was a decision that came out after the Paris Agreement, and of course we can learn a lot from our sister convention in terms of how that has been developed, as well as where have been some of the setbacks that we can avoid as we move forward at this time. So I think we, from the Secretariat point of view, are doing that analytical work and working with our counterparts in the Climate Secretariat, as well as in other secretariats that have platforms for non-state actors, and definitely have benefited a lot from this discussion, and hope to hear more from those on this call so that we can draw further ideas that we can bring to the attention to the parties. Thank you.
Thank you, Kathleen. I'll move to Marina. I think you actually have heard the call from Kathleen in terms of more ideas and more inputs into the process. So if you actually wear the hat of negotiator, if you wear the hat of somebody who is experienced in this, who wants to actually put in place a mechanism, and a mechanism that can be formally recognized, what would you basically envisage are the steps between now and COP15, COP16?
Thank you, and thank you for this difficult question. But in fact, I don't believe the CBD will manage to do this. It has not happened so far, so I don't think the CBD Secretariat is the right fora to be the mechanism. In fact, it has not been mentioned today, but I think all biodiversity-related conventions has a role to play. And there I mentioned CITES, CMS, UNESCO World Heritage, also regional conventions. I think we need to gather, it's not only a CBD issue and business. It's a UN, it's a much bigger thing to do for the biodiversity. And I don't think the CBD has the muscles to do it. And also, I don't think the CBD is too well known for that. So I'm a little bit provocative in this regard. But I have been involved too long for this, and I don't think the CBD will change for being a mechanism. So I think this is a mechanism that needs to be somewhere outside, and I really appreciate the interventions made by the IPLCs here, but also those working on the ground, that we need to have an audit issue embedded here. There needs to be a third party or some kind of institution who has this capacity to do the auditing of these commitments as well. Because, I'm still afraid about all kinds of greenwashing. I don't know if you guys has been reading this long-term mainstreaming approach coming out from the Secretariat now that should be negotiated during SBI3. I mean, it's horrendous. It's it should be on mainstreaming in different sector, and it's only on business and biodiversity, and it's that's it. And I don't know how this action plan even, I mean, has been prepared, and I'm quite upset about that. That's my first thing. All MEAs needs to be, which are biodiversity related, involved in this, because this is a much bigger issue than only CBD. Secondly, I think we need to also, in one way, align us with the SDGs, Sustainable Development Goals, because those development goals has the political attention in governments on a much higher level than only biodiversity. So I think still we need to think about this, but the mechanism is needed. I think the commitments by everybody is also needed, but it needs to be, as we say, all flowers can flower, but I think we need to organize this, because I don't think the Secretariat, CBD Secretariat, has delivered. I mean, we have had since Hyderabad, COP12, serious commitments on the table, and I have not seen anything in this regard. I end here, but I think we can do much better. Thanks SDGs, MEAs, and all indigenous people, local communities, gender, youth, they are our future. Thanks.
Thanks, Marina. But I think in all fairness to the Secretariat responds to inputs, responds to comments, responds to decisions that are made by the parties. So certainly both the parties as well as other stakeholders who actually participate in putting into the process, sit as observers and be responsible for the action, should also be equally responsible to push some of this agenda forward. That brings me to both Rita and Adele in terms of your quick 1-minute comments. In terms of the, I would say, expansion of the focus of the High Ambition Coalition, because that's not going to be, a point of discussion now. But how do you see the High Ambition Coalition being a little inclusive in terms of absorbing some of these messages and reflecting as and when you go forward in your action?
Thank you, Bala. I will try to be very precise in 1 minute. I do think that in the work of the High Ambition Coalition, we have to be much more inclusive, and that's something that we are trying to do. For instance, we are working now on a task force within the coalition to have discussions with IPLCs and see how we can have a dialogue and construct our narrative and work together in the run-up to the COP15. I think that within the coalition, we have to try the coalition of, I'm talking about the High Ambition Coalition for Nature and People. I won't talk about the other ones, but I believe that within the coalition, we have to be very inclusive, and we have to take into account the different perspective, so our work is much more efficient at the end, because if not, then we will be much less efficient, and we will duplicate our work. So I believe that within the coalition, we are trying to be very inclusive and try to build those bridges and see how we can also be a very vocal in being as inclusive as we can in our work in the run-up to COP15. And I'll give the floor to Adele so she can wrap up in her minute.
Yes, thank you, Rita. I mean, Rita already said it all, so I won't be long as well.
Yes. Adele,
yeah. No, yes, really, just to say that, yes, so we work with task force. So we have one task force reflecting on IPLC and conservation issues, but we also have other task force reflecting on qualitative elements of the targets, levels of protection. And I think this is through this little task force that we are able to really discuss more in depth, and so really be more inclusive than when we are in with the whole membership. So that's why we aim to reproduce as much as needed, to be really sure that take into account everyone's opinion, and really to have concrete messages also at the end. Yes, I think I'll end there.
Thanks, Adele. Tom, your 1 minute, and of course you did mention about the accountability, the transparency when you mentioned about the audit, but do you have any quick comment based on the inputs provided by other colleagues?
Yes, thank you. What Marina stressed already is that field activities are very important in the context of the CBD. What I notice also from this discussion is that the distance between these kind of discussions and what really happens in the field by the non-state actors is very large. I think for them it is almost impossible to understand and to follow these discussions we are having here. So it is very important to get more language which is applicable to them too. Very important to add voluntary non-binding activities to the convention. What I mentioned already is that the worldwide register of initiatives is very important. And what I said already, VCA has a lot of field-based experience. It is already a register that is active in the field. So it really could contribute to that worldwide register. Thanks.
Thank you, Tom. Ronaldo, you have quick 1 minute. Of course, there is a recognition, and I was very happy to hear from Rita about AI Ambition Coalition also working through the task force. But you have 1 minute intervention in terms of the next steps.
I want to start first responding, Marina, about the importance of CBD. And hello, Marina, as I hope you remember me from COP14 at Sharm el-Sheikh. The importance, in my opinion, and I think from indigenous people, IPLCs, about CBD is that it relates to land rights and governance issues that IPLCs demand on different platforms. And we have seen that environmental rights and human rights and educational rights, etc., haven't been sufficient to defend the rights of indigenous peoples. So CBD has a great opportunity to provide a much secure platform, particularly the high-level political forum on sustainable development that I attended last year, and only is focused on countries' compliance on different indicators. And there are, for example, many countries that were considered major violators of human rights, and suddenly by the change of a couple of indicators, suddenly they complied, and they are in a better shape. Also, there are lots of human resources, genders, human rights issues, gender issues, rights issues, and poverty issues that are all mixed into the sustainable development bag without clear indication of indigenous governments. So I see that there are 4 quick steps that I consider very important. One is the importance of educating stakeholders about the legal history between nation states and IPLCs, because what we have seen in the conversation at COP14 with many national delegations, and that is that the political appointments turnover is high. In many cases, functionaries and appointees come with 1 or 2 years of experience, and they have not been educated at all about the obligations that their nation states have with indigenous peoples. The second one is to promote constitutional reforms to strengthen the idea that indigenous peoples and local communities are peoples, not just individual organizations and communities, and not just families. They are peoples with a whole legal history before colonization. The third one is to involve research in universities on the creation of spaces for much better and informed interaction between IPLCs and governance and other voices. And finally, transform the protocols of engagement between science research and other voices with indigenous peoples, with the actual use of indigenous of the free, prior, and informed consent mechanism. It's important that IPLCs, to mention that we are in the process of towards self-management of genetic resources, the importance of community seed banks that present South-South international cooperation development, and mutual learning between IPLCs in order to confront common issues across the world. Thank you.
Thank you very much. I think we just shot past by about 3 minutes beyond our schedule in terms of the time. And did receive some comments, very, very pertinent comments in terms of assessments that are available on the role and contributions of non-state actors, the relevance of local biodiversity strategies and local biodiversity actions, experience from Sweden that was shared by Per in terms of citizen involvement in implementation of the biodiversity components, the role of indicators, because Per did mention about the need to have indicators, and this discussion, I'm sure, is going to begin much earlier as soon as the new framework gets adopted, because we have learned from the past that that actually forms a very critical background within which we can proceed on implementation. And of course, comment that is related to the need for transparency and accountability. So certainly, that provides us, two or three, to me, parting messages from this particular session. One, a lot is happening, both at the level of state-driven actions and impacts. But there is also an enormous amount of activity that is being carried out by other stakeholders, what we call as the non-state actors, the local communities, the indigenous people, private sector, all the different people. But the struggle has been that how do we, coordinate? How do we communicate between these two actions so that as and when we are counting towards our successes or failures towards achieving the targets, we actually are not losing out on the enormous contributions of the non-state actors, and only look at what the governments and what the states are doing towards achieving their biodiversity targets. The second element of it is that how do we now put together a mechanism, again based on our experience of ability or inability to count how the commitments are translated into actions on the ground. How do we come up with a coordination mechanism that is going to be a larger discussion that will happen at the level of SubStar, at the level of SBI, and also at the level of COP to come up with something. But it is very important that we have some, at least we have the nationally determined contributions that is, seen as a kind of a guidepost in terms of what countries are doing towards the climate change actions. Of course, the big challenge we have in biodiversity is unlike climate change, where we have one target to which everybody is working, which is not beyond 1.5 degree centigrade of climate change. But in biodiversity, it's a little bit more complex because of the number of issues, the number of stakeholders, and all that kind of thing. And the second point, which is very, very important, is the transparency and accountability of actions and impacts of actions by different stakeholders, the non-state actors. I think we also need to look at how do we start putting in place a mechanism that can look at the possibility of coming up with such kinds of transparency or accountability frameworks. Rita mentioned, Adele mentioned, Kathleen mentioned, all of you mentioned about a number of initiatives. The voluntary conservation area is one of such initiatives, but certainly how these initiatives can be measured. What is the impact of these? Who is contributing to that? What is the kind of long-term, impact of some of these actions is something which we are also looking at. So certainly we have, as I mentioned, we have, several dots. We have a lot of initiatives, but it is time for us to bring many of these initiatives together, many of these activities together, so that together we contribute. Of course, I'm aware Secretariat is trying its best in terms of collating all the different kinds of inputs. They're working, extremely hard in terms of bringing all these experiences, presenting some of them, listening to the parties, trying to be as inclusive as possible in trying to deal with it. But at the end of the day, I think all of us who are a part of this group, or as well as outside, will have a very, very important role to play in strengthening and supporting the convention and the convention secretariat in terms of translating these intents into actions on the ground. So certainly that leaves us with more work to do and a few ideas that we can take from here as and when we sit for discussing the final elements of the Global Biodiversity Framework 2021 to 2030 and as well as its implementation. But certainly, as mentioned at the beginning by Raphael, we are going to come up with a short report of the key points that were raised for the benefit of all of you, and certainly you can pick up that information on the report from the Earthmind website fairly soon. But certainly, thank you very much for your time, for your contribution, and we do have a plan, but the challenge is how do we translate the plan into something that is action on the ground. So with that, I'd like to thank all the panelists for your time. For those of you who are quite early in the morning, your sacrifice to have more cups of coffee that you were unable to have to join us now. Thank you very much, and good afternoon and good evening to all the colleagues. We'll keep in touch, and more certainly will be coming. Thank you very much, and thanks to Raphael for all her support. and also to colleagues at Earthmind for thinking of this idea and pulling this entire thing together. Thank you very much. Thanks, Catalina, Rita, Adele.
Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Bala. Thank you.
Thank you.
So all, have a good day.
Bye-bye. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Have a good day.